Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen DeFalco. I'm with the MIT Sloan Research Papers team. It's my pleasure today to introduce Jason Robbins and Peter Jennings, who will be presenting Daily Fantasy Sports, tips from a DraftKings Pro. The presentation will last 20 minutes, after which we will hold a 5-minute Q&A session, for which I'll be walking around the room with the microphone for anyone who has any questions. So please join me in welcoming Jason and Peter.
Thank you all for coming to our presentation. I'm going to speak briefly and then turn it over to Peter, as he has got the much more interesting topic to talk about. But for those who aren't familiar, DraftKings is a leading daily fantasy sports site. Daily fantasy is the newest way to play fantasy sports. Instead of picking a team for a whole year, you pick for one day, and you can go and you can win money and play against thousands of people or one-on-one matches for anything you want. So lots of different variety and lots of different cool sports to choose from. And DraftKings itself has been around about 3 years, a little bit less. We're really excited about what we've seen on it from a growth perspective, but also all the founders of DraftKings were big sports and big fantasy sports fans beforehand. So for us, this is really cool. And getting a chance to see how a pro like Peter goes about making his picks and how he utilizes statistics and modeling is just fascinating to me, not just from a business perspective, but as a fantasy player. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who is going to walk through how he approaches fantasy sports with a modeling slant. Here you go.
Thanks so much, Jason. And it's obviously a really exciting industry at this point. It's a blessing to be able to play fantasy sports for a living at this point. And there's a lot of analytics that you can use to become a profitable player. So the first thing I want to talk about is the different game types in daily fantasy and how it's important to understand what types of games you're playing because you use a different strategy depending on the game type. So the first game is a traditional head-to-head game. That'd be where one of you guys play myself or you play a one-on-one game against anyone else. And basically this game is really important to understand the strategy for because it's a lot different than a tournament or a 50-50. In a one-on-one game, basically you're trying to have the highest floor possible with your players. So you're looking for more consistent guys rather than a boom or bust player. As you can see here on the graph, the average winning score for a head-to-head game is actually the lowest of the 3 games here. So you generally try to take guys who are going to be consistent, like I said, and guys who are going to play, in football they're going to get a lot of opportunities, basketball they're going to get a lot of minutes. The other type of game that's similar to head-to-heads is 50-50s. And basically in a 50-50 game, there'd be 10, 20, 40, 50, 100 people in this game, and all you have to do is just be above average. And it's a similar strategy to a head-to-head game in that you want to take a high floor approach. You don't need to go for the boom or bust players because you just need to be above average. And one thing that I think is really important when you're starting off in daily fantasy is to play these games, and you can actually analyze rosters of the other winning players. So that's something that I did when I first got going in this. I really tried to analyze what other winning players were doing, and it's a great thing that you can take advantage of in these 50-50 games. Probably the sexiest type of game that a lot of people are intrigued with, definitely the big prizes you've seen on DraftKings with the millionaire makers, are games that are referred to as GPPs. And these are the games where you really need to be the top 10%, top 1%, or even the top 0.1% to win. So in this type of game, you're going to take a different type of strategy. Basically, you want to have boom or bust type players, and you want to maximize your ceiling rather than your floor. So you're looking to take guys, who might have that 3-touchdown game, or a guy who could hit 2 home runs in a baseball game. It's really all about the ceiling. You don't care about floor as much because, as you can tell here, even if you had just an average winning score for a head-to-head game, that's not going to win you any money in a GPP. So it's really important to maximize your ceiling in these type of games, and you're really looking for guys who have boom or bust potential here. So another cool part of daily fantasy I think that's really important to understand that can help you in these different types of contests is understanding correlation. Correlation is a huge part of daily fantasy for every different type of sport. For football, one thing that I like to talk about a lot is basically stacking a quarterback and a receiver or a quarterback and a tight end because of the correlation effect. So imagine you take Peyton Manning. If he has a good game, it's very likely that Demaryius Thomas or Julius Thomas is going to have a good game as well. So basically by taking Peyton Manning and Demaryius Thomas, when Demaryius Thomas scores a touchdown, obviously Peyton Manning threw it, you're going to get double the points. So in a tournament, like I was explaining before, it's really important to take advantage of this correlation aspect by basically pairing a quarterback with a receiver or a tight end. And there's negative correlation spots as well. Generally, you don't want to take a quarterback with a running back unless that running back's a pass-catching running back, because in a game, there's only so many touchdowns that can be scored. The running back's oftentimes going to take away fantasy points from like a Peyton Manning or a Tom Brady. So understanding correlation and how to utilize that is really, really important. And as you can see here, obviously, as a quarterback scores more points, it's more likely that a receiver is going to score a lot of points to that quarterback as well. And then basketball, which is going on right now, which is probably my favorite daily fantasy sport, it's all about minutes. So you can see here there's a high correlation with fantasy points and minutes played. And more so than almost any other sport, baseball is an event-based sport, the NFL is an event-based sport, basketball is just all about opportunity. So you really want to target guys who are going to get a lot of minutes. And one thing that you can utilize to basically find guys who are going to get more minutes is injuries. So one of the biggest things for me when I'm making daily fantasy basketball rosters is trying to figure out which guys are going to have an extra opportunity that day because of an injury or a different rotation. So you know, backup point guards, backup centers, these guys are going to get a lot of extra minutes when the person in front of them gets injured, and oftentimes you're going to get a lot of value that way. So this is something I think that everyone in here, you know, obviously being an analytics conference, would be interested in. That's modeling. Basically, there's a big trend in modeling now towards predicting players in daily fantasy sports. So there's a variety of different things that can go into a model depending on the sport that you're looking at. Here's an example of basically a basketball model that I've used in the past, and there's a lot of different things that can go into this that can basically help you predict which players are going to do well. So in the NBA, I really like to look at defense versus position. I like to look at pace. I like to look at basically which teams are giving up more threes. There's a variety of different things that you can put into a model to predict what players are going to do well. In baseball, this is something that's very applicable as well. You know, you're considering things like park, umpire, you're considering the weather. There's a lot of things that you can put in, and basically you can use stats and math to help predict which players are going to do really well. So I think it's a really important concept that a lot of people are definitely getting into more and more, especially with the prize pools getting bigger, and certainly something that you guys can take advantage of is modeling. So we have a couple cool things going on, and I wanted to save some time to talk specifically about today with the NBA, but DraftKings is offering a free roll for everyone here. As you can see here, there's you can go to DraftKings.com/SSAC-2015 for a free roll. First place is going to get $500. This, of course, is free to play, and the top 100 places will get paid. So this is going to be exciting. It's today for the NBA, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about which NBA guys I like today, just because hopefully I can win some of you guys some money. Specifically, there's a couple games in particular today that I think are really important to target. One of them is the Golden State Warriors Toronto Raptors game. And one of the reasons I think this is a really good game to target is it's projected to have the most points of any game today. It's going to be a high-paced game. Golden State plays with the fastest pace in the NBA, and Toronto actually plays pretty fast as well. So you consider guys like Stephen Curry, Kyle Lowry, even someone like Klay Thompson. So there's a lot of value potentially in that game. In addition to that game, one game that I think is really, really important to look at is the Oklahoma City Thunder at the Portland Trail Blazers. We all saw what Russell Westbrook did last night, another triple-double. He's been absolutely incredible. So if you're going to spend up on a player, I certainly think he's one of the best options, if not the best option. He, going back to the modeling thing, he has a really, really high usage rate with Kevin Durant off the floor. So he's an incredible play tonight. And then Portland actually has a multitude of guys that you can be looking at as well. If LaMarcus Aldridge plays, he's a great play. And in addition to that, Damian Lillard is also a great play. So I would be targeting those two games in particular. And the other thing that I think is really important when constructing a roster today is to look for the injuries. James Harden is another guy who is questionable tonight with an ankle injury. So you want to make sure you're looking to see if he plays and monitoring the other injuries as well. So that's what's going on tonight with the NBA. I guess at this point we can turn it for questions.
Do you have any value plays you like tonight?
Any value plays that I like tonight? If James Harden doesn't go, I think that Trevor Ariza is a really good value play today. In addition to that, I think that there's some other value at the wing. Terrence Jones for the Rockets could be another good play, because if James Harden sits, that's going to increase the usage rate for a lot of guys that are going to potentially have to fill in for him tonight.
Great. Do you want to do Q&A?
Yeah.
How much would you say, two things, momentum and your intuition, that, kind of balance against your modeling when it comes to making money?
Yeah, so momentum.
Sorry, can we repeat the questions? Yeah. Just in case I don't get to you in time with the mic.
How much would you say intuition and, what did it say, momentum of a player, like you mentioned Westbrook, balance against the model you have?
Yeah, so momentum is a really big part of it. Obviously, you want to analyze how guys have done recently and if they're trending in the right direction. In basketball, they'll often be trending in the right direction because they have more opportunities. So that's a big part of it. I do think that in other sports, people have a recency bias. So they'll, like in baseball, if someone hit a home run 2 days in a row, they'll probably take that too much into account. So it really depends on the sport. But intuition is also a huge aspect of it as well. Depending on the sport, again, I think the NFL and the NBA, you can use that more to your advantage, whereas in baseball, you should really just stick more to the statistics.
Just because it's a data conference, I've found it really hard with you guys in general to be able to get much data. I know you delete the data of your games that you have every 7 days. How can we get the data like Pete had in the beginning of the average scores of tournaments, kind of the distribution of scores that happen? Is DraftKings doing things to make that available to the players or to kind of educate everyone on those kind, because there's really interesting statistics without having to go through, all 400 of your games and download the individual history. So
That's a great question. We've talked a lot about that, and I think the short answer is yes, we are working towards how to make more data available, and we're just trying to figure out what the appropriate type of data is and also how to present it in a way that allows people to digest it properly and isn't confusing and difficult UX. So we are definitely aware that people would like access to more. This stuff here is also, some of this is available. We've done some content work, for example. This was from a book written by Jonathan Bales. So there's other places that we've made data available that if you guys are interested that we can share. But we're looking to add more to the website and mobile app so that people can get it and access it and making their picks, and also in crafting what their strategies are.
that would be great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
In the hyper-competitive market that is European and Asian sportsbooks, a professional syndicate will be doing very well to make a 1 to 1.5% margin. What sort of margins would a good US daily fantasy sports professional player be looking at making?
That's a great question. I think the one big advantage, and one thing I wanted to touch on initially, the huge benefit of playing on DraftKings is that you're playing peer-to-peer. So you have a much bigger advantage playing against another individual versus the house like you're referencing. So it depends on the type of games, and obviously the industry is still relatively new, so it's hard to definitively say because we don't have huge sample sizes. But you can have a really big advantage, especially if you're playing someone inferior in a one-on-one game, you could win 70, even 80% of the time. It's really hard to say in tournaments because obviously if you win $1 million in a tournament, that's going to skew your results, and you're going to have a very high return on investment. But over time, how sustainable is that? So I do think that people, I don't have an exact answer for you, but there is definitely a very high ROI, and you can have significantly higher than 1 or 1.5%.
I had a question about the daily fantasy industry in general. Given how much faster the money flows from bad players to good players as opposed to a sport like poker, how worried are you about the ecosystem drying up over the long term and the money running out, and what are you doing to fight that?
I think that's a great question. So I don't think the money flows quite as quickly as you might think from players that aren't as good to players that are. There's certainly a skill differential, but what we've seen is that as players, people learn, right? So as players spend time, they get better. And they also learn to maybe avoid certain types of games or opponents if they're not doing so well. So when Peter's talking about winning 70+%, unlikely that person's going to keep playing Peter over and over again. They figure out he's good and has to move on to the next thing. So overall, it's not maybe as bad as some of the ROIs might see in terms of money flow, and also you see a real benefit from players who stick around and try to consume content and get better. That said, it is absolutely something that we are focused on, and if you look at what some of the features that we've implemented are so far, you'll see that some of those are set up to directly address that. For example, we have beginner games in every sport that if you've played at least 50 games in that sport, you can't play. So somebody like Peter has tapped out every single sport, you won't find him there. You'll be able to play against other people that are new to it. We also have the ability, if you're playing one-on-one games, to say that you don't want to play against any single opponent more than once. So you can end up with a bunch of matchups against people you don't want. And you can also block individual opponents too if you don't want to play them. We've also added a lot of content and tutorial material to help people understand who to pick and how to understand strategy in the game. And this is all just scratching the surface. We're going to be doing much more, but I think the right way to address it is just to put the tools in the hands of the players to educate themselves, to make sure they can play against the players they want to play against and the games they want to play against. And so far, that's how we've been looking at it. Fundamentally, being a game of skill, you're kind of not going to change that. You have to change it through experience and helping educate people.
Hi, my question's for Peter. In the GPPs, you talked about creating a high ceiling lineup of boom-bust guys. But I'd imagine the pros probably figured out that strategy and have very similar lineups. How much do you focus on creating a unique lineup that's more differentiated than just the theoretically optimized lineup that probably a lot of guys could arrive at similar conclusions for the GPPs?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you hit on a big topic that is really important for GPPs, and that's the element of being a contrarian. So like you said, a lot of guys are going to end up on the same players because it's very obvious these are the guys who are the optimal plays, they're the highest projected players, and they've achieved high ceilings in the past. So oftentimes there'll be a lot of value in going contrarian, especially in an event-based sport like baseball or hockey, or even football, where touchdowns are a huge part of fantasy. You end up taking guys who you think aren't going to be quite as popular as the traditional chalk plays. So there's a lot of value in that, especially in the event-based sports. So that's something that I try to employ. Definitely not a strategy I would use in the 50-50 games or the head-to-head games, but especially like in baseball, if you think a team is not going to have much exposure from the other players and you take them, you're in a great position because even the best players like Mike Trout can still go 0 for 4 that day.
You talked about in football stacking players like a quarterback with a receiver. In basketball, how many, let's say for tonight's Golden State versus Toronto game, how many players would you feel comfortable stacking? Would you play 3 or 4 guys from the same team? Would you play 6 or 8 from the same game, knowing that it's going to be a fast-paced game, high scoring, potentially close, so you're not worried about, after 3 quarters that there's going to be a bench. Do you play much 6 and 8 guys in the same game lineups?
Yeah, it's a great question. So basically, is there value in stacking a game overall? And there can be. Basically, you're rooting for one outcome if you do decide to stack a game. The Toronto Golden State game could be a great example of that because it is supposed to be high paced with a lot of scoring. And the event that you're looking for to win a GPP would be overtime or double overtime, where basically the players are going to get a lot more minutes. But in general, I try to stay away from stacking in the NBA because, if Steph Curry has 35 or 40 points, it's probably unlikely that Klay Thompson's going to have a big game. When Klay Thompson scored 37 points in that quarter, Steph Curry did not have a good fantasy game. So it's really important to kind of understand the likelihood of the guys going off together in basketball, which is lower than other sports. In baseball, if a team scores 10 runs, everyone's going to do really well. There is the one outcome that can be very good for you, though, in a basketball game. If you do get overtime, double overtime, even if you're fortunate enough to get triple overtime, you'll definitely be in great shape. But for the most part, I try to stay away from it in basketball.
You mentioned the modeling. Are you using advanced techniques like regression, or are you primarily a simple correlation type analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for baseball, I'm just starting to get into more stuff with regression, obviously to back test stuff. And baseball, you have a lot more data. You have a bigger sample size because of how many games there are. For football, it's something that I haven't dived into as much. I'm just basically using a lot of correlation stuff. one thing that I think is really important for football that most people don't look at is line of scrimmage stats. And there aren't that many stats out there, but you can figure out a lot of stuff that's going on, basically who's winning at the line of scrimmage. So to answer your question, in certain sports, I think that I've gotten a little bit more advanced, but certainly there's a lot of improvement, and there's a lot of smart guys who are pushing the envelope.
Yeah, a couple questions that could probably go to either of you, potentially. But I wanted to know, how do you, in kind of a detailed way, assign a dollar value to a player? And for Peter, more specifically, do you ever try to take advantage of any inefficiencies in the valuation?
Do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, I'll quickly answer the first one. We have a model first that outputs based on prior stats, and it looks at both prior seasons for a little while in the beginning as well as current season. And then there's other factors depending on the sport. So for example, in baseball, we'll factor in pitching matchup for hitters. And I am sure there are tons of inefficiencies. I'll let Peter take that. But the last thing I'll say is we do try to look at it, because in any model you do get a lot of inefficiency, and manually correct anyone that we think is off. And sometimes that'll happen when, in the cases Peter said, where we know there's an injury, so this player's statistics previously don't reflect what they're doing in the last couple games, and you can't change the whole model to weight recency more. You got to do it manually. But generally, we'll try to start with what the model output is. I'll take the second part.
No, that's a great question. That's really the name of the game, is finding inefficiencies in the pricing. So the one advantage you have as a player is the prices are normally made the day before. That's so DraftKings can get up the contest. So they use their information, they use their model, and they put out the prices. And a lot of times, especially in a sport like basketball, injury news will happen, someone will sit out a game, and that's where you can really find the inefficiencies in the pricing. And sometimes there are a couple mistakes that could be made, and you'll find players that are drastically overpriced or underpriced, and you can actually use both situations to your advantage. Going back to the contrarian question, one thing that I think is a really powerful strategy is actually paying up for a player that seems overpriced and probably is overpriced relative to their expectation, but basically overpaying for that player in the hope that they have a great game, and because you overpaid for the player, hopefully you're contrarian. So that's another thing that you can do. But there's a lot of inefficiencies, especially since DraftKings has to post the pricing. For football, they normally post it on Monday. A lot of news will come out. Basketball, they have to post it the day in advance, and a lot of things change. So that's really where the most inefficiencies in the pricings are.
So we have time for one more quick question if anyone has one.
Yep.
This is for Jason. I notice you guys are sponsoring a lot more clubs, or NHL, NBA, so on and so forth. How do you go in determining the value of that sponsorship and how much brand equity it provides to you?
Sure. So first, before I answer that, I will say this is why Pete's next level. I thought the objective was to find inefficiency in who's underpriced, but he figured out a way to make it profitable to take guys who are overpriced. So it's pretty impressive there. But to answer your question, so we do have a number. We have over 25 deals with teams across the major sports leagues. We have several major leagues, MLB, NHL, UFC, amongst others. There's a lot of modeling work that we do. We have a great analytics team. We understand what type of value we're looking for in terms of customer acquisition costs. And then the one piece you mentioned, the brand equity, that's a little harder to quantify. So a lot of that is kind of understanding at a base level what we think the deal can produce in pure numbers, and then making sure we get it as close to that as possible. And we place some value on the brand equity, but most of how we look at it is really how can we make this work as much for us as possible on the customer acquisition side and on the product side. Because there are deals we have that aren't just about marketing. We have, for example, with our deal with baseball, they have an integration of their content. We have highlight players, and if you're an MLB TV subscriber, they have this cool little red zone type of setup that you can do, or it will flip to your games. And other things that we do involve content integration. So the NHL produces a daily fantasy DraftKings podcast, a video show every morning, and a lot of that we see as adding value to the product as well.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much, Peter and Jason.